Greetings, viewers. The topic I'm going to talk to you about today is one that you should definitely hear at the end if you follow the global economy, especially the development of small open economies. Can you believe it? New Zealand, once known as paradise on earth, faced its toughest economic challenge in decades in the first half of 2025, with a 0.9% contraction in economic growth in a single quarter. However, in the second half of the year, New Zealand's economy made a dramatic turnaround, with economic growth in the fourth quarter picking up 0.7% year-on-year, and per capita growth rising by 0.4%. This is the first positive quarterly growth in 2 years, marking New Zealand's formal emergence from recession. Some people may ask, New Zealand is so far away from us. What has its economic ups and downs got to do with us? In fact, this wave of economic ups and downs in New Zealand epitomizes many small open economies around the world. The problems it has exposed, the measures it has taken to cope with them, and the signals of recovery that have emerged might foreshadow the future direction of other similar economies. Whether you are an investor, a business owner, or simply want to understand global economic megatrends, understanding New Zealand's economy can help you gain insight into hidden risks and opportunities. Next, let's take a quick look at the overall pulse of the New Zealand economy in 2025 in the first half of the year. The New Zealand economy was sluggish overall, especially in the second quarter, with weakness across the board in the goods-producing sectors. As a result of the U.S. tariff policy at the beginning of the year, manufacturing orders fell sharply, the BNZ Business NZ Manufacturing Performance Index plummeted, and production activity contracted significantly, directly pulling down the overall economic growth rate. The situation in the construction sector is not much better, although the Central Bank of New Zealand has begun to release interest rate cut signals. It still takes time for the policy effect to be transmitted to the market. As a result, the construction sector continued to face the triple pressure of high costs, stalled projects and fewer buyers in the second quarter, making it one of the main drags on the economy. The performance of the service sector was mixed. Retail trade achieved 3 consecutive quarters of growth, with the interest rate cut policy providing an incipient boost to household consumption. However, the overall service sector sentiment remained low, with the service sector performance index standing at only 48.3 in September 2025, which has been below the withering line of 50 for 19 consecutive months, suggesting that most of the service sectors are still in a state of contraction. However, after November, consumer and business confidence began to recover gradually, laying the foundation for the subsequent economic recovery. In the money market, market expectations of a rate cut by the central bank continued to be high, as the New Zealand dollar exchange rate fluctuated sharply in the first half of the year due to the weak economy. However, as signs of economic recovery emerged in the fourth quarter, the volatility of the NZD exchange rate gradually stabilized. Next, I will share a set of key data. The Central Bank of New Zealand implemented 3 rate cuts in 2025. The official cash rate was cut by 25 bps to 3.5% in April, another 25 bps to 3.25% in May, and a further cut to 2.25% in November, for a cumulative rate cut of 125 bps. This reduction was much smaller than the 300 basis points expected by the market before, and it can be seen that the Central Bank of New Zealand's policy adjustment was still prudent and did not blindly follow the trend of drastic interest rate cuts. In terms of business operations, the first half of the year was indeed under great pressure. Many enterprises began to cut back on spending, and their willingness to invest decreased significantly. 2025 in August, the number of business liquidations rose 26% year-on-year. Among them, the construction industry was the hardest hit. Over the past year, 765 construction companies went bankrupt, up 46% year-on-year. The hospitality sector did not fare well either, with 297 bankruptcies, up 49% year-on-year. However, in the second half of the year, as the economy gradually recovered, the growth rate of business liquidations began to slow down. From July to November, the cumulative number of business liquidations was 237, showing no sustained significant growth. In addition, the construction industry also began to show signs of recovery, with a marked increase in the number of building permits issued and the volume of construction works, which is one of the important signals of economic improvement. Next, I would like to clarify an issue that has been misunderstood by many people before. That is, the immigration situation in New Zealand. It was previously reported that New Zealand had its first net outflow of immigrants in more than a decade. However, according to the latest official figures, for the year ending September 2025, New Zealand is actually still experiencing net migration growth of 12,400. Just a significant drop from the 42,400 recorded in the same period in 2024. The really serious problem is the net loss of citizens. In the year to August 2025, a record 73,900 New Zealand citizens settled out of the country, a net loss of 47,900 citizens. And most of the loss is of skilled people, professionals such as nurses, engineers and teachers, many of whom have chosen to go to Australia. Why is this happening? The core reason is that the cost of living within New Zealand is too high, while salary growth has not kept pace. In Q3 2025, average hourly earnings in New Zealand grew by 0.5% YoY, and for the year as a whole, the average hourly earnings growth rate was 3.9%, compared to the Consumer Price Index CPI of 3.0%, with real salary growth of only 0.9%, and even negative real salary growth in some sectors. The labor cost index increased by 2.1% year-on-year, which is lower than the rate of inflation, resulting in a decrease in real income for many workers. In contrast, Australia has become the destination of choice for these skilled workers, as it has a clear advantage in terms of salary packages and cost of living. The picture on the unemployment front is not encouraging either. 2025 in the third quarter, New Zealand's unemployment rate rose to a 5-year high of 5.3%. The youth unemployment rate was a staggering 15.3%, while the unemployment rates for Maori and Pacifica were significantly higher than the national averages at 10.2% and 11.4% respectively. 2026. The weak job market further prompted some workers to choose to go abroad to look for development opportunities, forming a vicious circle. The blew but were the result of a series of internal structural problems accumulated over a long period of time, which intertwined with each other and gradually eroded the foundations of economic development, with one of the most central cruxes of the problem being the continued stagnation of productivity. New Zealand was once hailed as one of the most balanced economies in the world, but the slow growth in labor productivity in recent years has become a key constraint on economic growth. This high input and low output has directly undermined the country's core competitiveness. Enterprises find it difficult to realize profit growth through efficiency improvements, which in turn affects wage levels and economic sustainability. According to a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD), New Zealand's weak investment has been more prominent since the global financial crisis. This problem has been further exacerbated in the wake of the new crown epidemic, which has resulted in a significant dampening of potential output growth. Productivity stagnation has also brought about a vicious circle. Businesses have to raise salaries in order to maintain operations. However, they are not efficient enough to absorb the increased costs. This ultimately drives inflation, and salary increases have not kept pace with inflation, further weakening the purchasing power of the population and the competitiveness of businesses, thus creating a deadly circle. Accelerating population aging is also a major structural pitfall. As of September 30, 2025, New Zealand's population will be approximately 5,334,200 people. As fertility rates decline and life expectancy increases, the proportion of older people continues to rise, while the working-age population grows more slowly. This not only increases the burden on public services, but also has a direct impact on overall economic growth. The most direct impact of aging is the significant increase in healthcare and pension expenditure. The government needs to invest more financial resources to protect the livelihood of the elderly. But the tax base is difficult to expand in tandem due to the sluggish growth of the working-age population, which has led to an increasingly pronounced imbalance between fiscal revenues and expenditures. At the same time, due to the increase in the elderly population, the supply in the labor market has decreased, and enterprises are facing an increasingly serious problem of labor shortage, especially in technology-intensive industries. The talent gap has further constrained industrial upgrading and productivity enhancement. The net loss of citizens mentioned earlier has also further aggravated the tight labor supply. leading to insufficient labor reserves in the future, forming a vicious circle of aggravation of aging, labor shortage, slowdown of economic growth, expansion of net loss of citizens. The vicious cycle of aging, labor shortage, slowing economic growth, expanding net loss of citizens, has further aggravated the structural problems of the economy. Regarding the real estate market, I would like to correct a misconception here. Many people believe that New Zealand's house prices are still continuing to fall. But in fact, in the fourth quarter of 2025, New Zealand's real estate market has officially ended its downward cycle and entered a rebound phase. According to the QV House Price Index, the average valuation of the nation's homes rose by 1.1% in the fourth quarter, with the average house price reaching NZD 910,100, which is still 13.1% lower than the peak in January 2022 but has risen by 0.9% compared to the same period in 2024, showing clear signs of recovery. In retrospect, the New Zealand real estate market had an irrational boom during the epidemic. In the 10 years from the beginning of 2015 to the end of 2024, the average list price rose by 60.3%, from 556,931 New Zealand dollars to 892,579 New Zealand dollars. During that time, many members of the public scrambled to acquire properties, leading to a significant rise in household debt levels and creating a false sense of wealth. At that time, house prices were rising much faster than household incomes. In 2000, houses cost about 5 times the median household income. By 2025, that ratio had risen to 7.5 times, making housing less affordable. However, market expectations are gradually improving as house prices stabilize in the fourth quarter of 2025. Tony Alexander, a leading independent economist, predicts that the upward trend in house prices will accelerate further between 2026 and 2027. But in the longer term, the average annual increase will be significantly lower than in the past. The rebound in the real estate market has also directly led to the development of the construction industry. In the fourth quarter, the number of bankruptcies of construction companies decreased significantly, and many previously stalled projects gradually resumed work, as the industry boom continued to pick up. This has undoubtedly brought an important favorable signal to the overall economic recovery. Let's talk about the export structure again. Previously, there were views that New Zealand's export structure is too homogeneous and overly dependent on the China-Australia market. This argument is actually somewhat one-sided. According to the latest data, in 2025, New Zealand's agricultural export performance is very strong and has achieved remarkable results in diversified market layout. New Zealand not only maintained its dominant position in the China-Australia market, but also achieved significant growth in exports to Europe. In the financial year to November 2025, New Zealand's fruit exports grew by 28% to 6.1 billion New Zealand dollars, and meat exports exceeded 10 billion New Zealand dollars for the first time, a record high. The year 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and New Zealand, with bilateral trade topping 41 billion New Zealand dollars, up 12% year-on-year. The Chinese market remains the core growth pole for New Zealand's agricultural exports, with the share of apple exports to China expanding from 23% to 30%, and infant formula exports to China growing 32% year-on-year, which is a strong growth momentum. Meanwhile, the New Zealand-EU Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect in May 2024, continues to release dividends. For the fiscal year ending June 2025, New Zealand's bilateral trade in goods and services with the EU reached 21.58 billion New Zealand dollars, up 8% year-on-year. Of this, New Zealand's exports to the EU grew by 28% to 7.88 billion New Zealand dollars. Dairy exports to the EU grew by 64% and horticultural products grew by 38%, a remarkable performance. In the second quarter of 2025, New Zealand's exports of goods and services totaled 28.9 billion New Zealand dollars, a significant increase from 26.3 billion New Zealand dollars in the same period in 2024, and a significant improvement in the sustainability of export growth. However, there are still some issues with New Zealand's export structure, such as an over-reliance on kiwifruit and apples for fruit exports, the sensitivity of core agricultural products to fluctuations in demand in key markets, and the need to improve sustainability. Overall, New Zealand has made significant progress in export diversification, which has also helped to increase its overall economic resilience. Having analyzed the internal problems, let us look at the impact of the external environment. In the first half of this year, the deterioration of the global economic environment has indeed exerted considerable pressure on the New Zealand economy. Among them, the high interest rate policy of major central banks around the world bore the brunt, directly pushing up New Zealand's borrowing costs. In order to cope with inflation worldwide, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other major global central banks have taken measures to raise interest rates and tighten their monetary policies. This has forced the Reserve Bank of New Zealand to join in the rate hike. Although the Reserve Bank of New Zealand implemented 3 interest rate cuts in 2025, lowering the official cash rate from 4.5% to 2.25%, the prolonged high interest rates have had a profound effect on the economy. High interest rates have directly contributed to the rising cost of home loans for households, with many facing increased pressure on their monthly payments. In July 2025, New Zealand's home loan delinquency rate, while improving slightly to 1.38%, still stood at 21,200 overdue home loans. In addition, the percentage of home loan delinquencies in the 50-plus age group is significantly higher than average, fluctuating between 2% and 2.5%. Repayment pressure remains high for this segment of the population. In addition, the rising cost of commercial loans has dampened the willingness of businesses to invest. Many enterprises had to postpone or cancel their investment plans due to high financing costs, leading to a slowdown in capital accumulation and further eroding the potential for productivity gains. In addition, the escalating cost of government debt has exacerbated fiscal pressures. During the epidemic, the government accumulated a large amount of debt to support the economy. High interest rates have led to a significant increase in interest payments on the debt, crowding out government fiscal space for public services and economic stimulus, further increasing the difficulty of policy regulation. With regard to the international trade environment, the uncertainty in global trade in the first half of the year did have some impact on New Zealand's export-oriented economy. However, with the gradual release of the dividends of free trade agreements and the gradual recovery of global trade in the second half of the year, this negative impact gradually weakened. In its Economic Outlook 2025 report, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) cited increased global trade barriers, tighter financial conditions, weakening business and consumer confidence, and rising policy uncertainty as posing significant risks to global economic growth. These risks hit small open economies in particular. Earlier in the year, adjustments to tariff policies in the United States had led to a significant drop in manufacturing orders in New Zealand. The Bank of New Zealand (BNZ) Business NZ Manufacturing Performance Index plummeted directly after the policy was announced, and weakness in the manufacturing sector pulled down economic growth directly in the second quarter. However, with the signing of the free trade agreement between New Zealand and the European Union and the deepening of trade with China, the momentum of export growth gradually recovered, effectively offsetting some of the trade risks. As one of New Zealand's largest trading partners, demand for New Zealand's high-quality agricultural products remained strong despite the slowdown in China's economic growth. And instead of the previously expected significant drop in demand, bilateral trade reached a record high. Other key trading partners, such as Australia and the United States, have also faced slowing growth in their own economies, but demand for New Zealand's agricultural imports has remained stable, with no significant impact on New Zealand's exports. In terms of economic growth, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) forecasts global gross domestic product (GDP) growth of 2.9% in 2025, with growth remaining at this low level in 2026. Among them, major economies such as the United States, Canada, Mexico, and China are experiencing a more pronounced growth slowdown, while other economies are also facing varying degrees of downward pressure on growth. The weak global economy had led to a general lack of demand in international markets, affecting not only New Zealand's merchandise exports, but also hitting service export sectors such as tourism. However, by the second half of 2025, international tourism was gradually picking up. In the second quarter, New Zealand service exports increased by 381 New Zealand dollars million to 7.5 billion New Zealand dollars compared to the same period in 2024. In the fourth quarter, increased activity in tourism-related sectors such as accommodation, restaurants, bars, transportation, and car rentals served as a key driver of the recovery. However, global economic uncertainty continued to exacerbate financial market volatility, and weakening investor confidence led to some capital outflow pressure from New Zealand. As the domestic economy recovered and interest rate policy stabilized, the volatility of the New Zealand dollar exchange rate gradually narrowed, and the pressure on import costs eased. The previous negative cycle of global growth slowdown, export decline, local currency depreciation, high inflation, has been broken, which is a positive signal for New Zealand's sustained economic recovery. New Zealand's economic difficulties in the first half of the year triggered a series of chain reactions, slowly spreading from the economy to people's livelihoods, forming a vicious cycle that is difficult to break. In the second half of the year, the cycle was initially contained as the economy recovered. The net loss of citizens was the starting point of this cycle in the first half of the year. The mass exodus of skilled workers and young professionals led directly to a shortfall in the domestic supply of factors of production and a subsequent contraction in productive activity. In the third quarter of 2025, New Zealand's labor utilization rate fell to 12.9%, up 1.2 percentage points from the same period in 2024. In particular, the labor utilization rates of Maori and Pacific Islanders reached 20.0% and 19.8%, respectively, which were significantly higher than those of other groups, reflecting a more serious problem of labor market idleness. Shrinking production has directly led to a decline in sales revenue and profitability, which in turn has forced companies to scale back investment and hiring, and even cut costs through layoffs. To 2025 in August, the number of New Zealand businesses going into liquidation increased by 26% year-on-year, with bankruptcies surging in sectors such as the construction and hospitality industries. Massive job losses have caused the unemployment rate to rise to 5.3%, with the youth unemployment rate reaching a recent high of 15.3%. The weak job market has a direct impact on the income level of the population. In the third quarter of 2025, New Zealand's average hourly wage increased by only 0.5% on a year-on-year basis. And after deducting the 3% consumer inflation rate, the real payroll increased by only 0.9%. Meanwhile, the labor cost index grew just 2.1% year-over-year, below the rate of inflation, resulting in a decline in real purchasing power for residents. Lagging income growth has led to a weakening of household spending power, with consumers scaling back spending, especially in the area of non-essential consumption. This has further exacerbated sales pressures on businesses, leading to a continued deterioration in business conditions, which in turn has inhibited investment and hiring, creating a vicious circle. Net loss of citizens, shrinking production, slumping consumption, stagnant investment, increasing unemployment, and ultimately, further loss of citizens. Shrinking household consumption also has a direct impact on government tax revenues. The growth of major sources of tax revenue, such as the goods and services tax and income tax, has slowed. While the government needs to invest more financial resources in public services such as unemployment benefits and health care, this led to a widening gap between fiscal revenues and expenditures, putting increasing fiscal pressure. However, by the second half of the year, this vicious cycle had eased as the economy gradually recovered. In the fourth quarter, national purchasing power, i.e. disposable income, grew by 1.2%, and household consumption confidence continued to rebound. Small and medium-sized enterprises (SMEs) were the hardest hit by the crisis in the first half of the year, and became the hardest hit by the recession because of limited access to finance and weaker risk tolerance, and struggled under the double squeeze of escalating costs and slumping sales. 2025 in August, the increase in the number of New Zealand businesses going into liquidation was mainly concentrated in SMEs. Among them, there were 765 business bankruptcies in the construction industry, up 46% year-on-year. 297 bankruptcy cases in the hospitality industry, up 49% year-on-year. And the number of SME bankruptcies in the real estate industry, the retail industry, and the transportation industry also ranked at the top. The closure of a large number of SMEs has not only caused mass unemployment, but also undermined the integrity of the industrial chain and affected the stability of the entire economic ecology. Although large enterprises are relatively more resilient to risks, they have also adopted a conservative business strategy against the backdrop of heightened economic uncertainties, choosing to hoard cash rather than expand their operations, further dragging down the momentum of overall economic growth. At one point, the business confidence index fell to its lowest point in recent years, with more than 16.5% of the working population worrying that they would lose their jobs. And companies were generally pessimistic about their future investment and business prospects. However, in the second half of the year, business confidence gradually rebounded as the economy recovered and policy support intensified. In November, both the consumer and business confidence indices rose markedly, with large enterprises beginning to gradually expand their investments and SMEs seeing marked improvement in their business conditions. The pressure on ordinary families' lives also increased significantly during the crisis in the first half of the year, and livelihood difficulties are becoming more and more prominent. On the one hand, due to falling house prices and high interest rates, many families are facing heavy pressure on their home loans. On the other hand, 480,000 people in New Zealand were in arrears in July 2025, an increase of 2,000 people compared with June. Although the serious delinquency of more than 90 days overdue has eased slightly, the overall credit situation is still not optimistic. The pressure on home loans is even heavier for households that purchased their homes at the peak of house prices. Some retirees are still repaying their home loans, and more than half of them will spend more than 80% of their pensions on housing costs, leading to a significant decline in quality of life. In addition to the pressure on home loans, the continuing rise in the cost of living is also overwhelming the average household. From October 2025 to 12 months ago, food prices rose by 4.7%. From September 2025 to 12 months ago, food prices rose by 4.1%. In addition, price increases for necessities such as rent and energy were also significant. However, pay growth has failed to keep pace, resulting in a continued decline in real purchasing power for households. In Q3 2025, New Zealand's cost of living inflation was 2.4%, which is lower than consumer inflation but still higher than the rate of pay growth for some groups. In particular, real pay growth for public sector employees was only 0.4%, making it difficult to cover the rise in the cost of living, while households in rural communities faced even more severe hardship. However, with the growth in agricultural exports in the second half of the year, farmers' incomes have gradually picked up and the economic pressure on rural areas has been eased to some extent. Thankfully, with a series of policy adjustments and improvements in the external environment, the New Zealand economy has shown clear signs of recovery, providing a solid foundation for the economy to stabilize and rebound. However, deep-rooted structural reforms still need to be pushed forward to realize a genuine economic recovery. Monetary policy adjustments have begun to play a positive role. The Central Bank of New Zealand implemented a cumulative total of 3 interest rate cuts in 2025, which effectively lowered borrowing costs, alleviated debt pressure on households and businesses, and stimulated household consumption and business investment. As of the first half of 2025, household consumption has shown signs of picking up. In addition, credit card spending has continued to increase, indicating a gradual recovery in consumer confidence, providing support for economic growth. In addition, the level of inflation has shown a gradual cooling trend. In the third quarter of 2025, consumer inflation declined to 3.0%, close to the midpoint of the Central Bank of New Zealand's target range of 1% to 3%. Meanwhile, business inflation expectations and core inflation levels are also in line with the medium-term inflation target, according to a number of agencies. New Zealand's consumer inflation is forecast to fall to 2.7% by the end of 2025 and further to about 2.2% in 2026. The easing of inflationary pressures will help boost consumer and business confidence, creating more favorable conditions for economic recovery. The recovery in international tourism has also brought about a turnaround in the New Zealand economy, injecting new vitality into the local economy. In the second quarter of 2025, New Zealand service exports grew by 381 million New Zealand dollars to 7 New Zealand dollars and 50 cents billion compared to the same period in 2024. One of the main drivers of growth was tourism. With the relaxation of global epidemic control measures and the rebound of international travel demand, the number of international tourists to New Zealand gradually increased, which drove the recovery of related industries such as hotels, restaurants, and retail. Activity in tourism-related sectors increased significantly in the fourth quarter, becoming one of the core drivers of economic growth. Hotel occupancy and food and beverage sales in some areas are now close to pre-epidemic levels. The recovery of the tourism industry has not only brought direct employment opportunities, but also promoted the development of related industrial chains, injecting new vitality into economic growth. In addition, the Small Business Confidence Index has rebounded from its low level and showed a clear upward trend in November, indicating that the pessimism of SMEs towards the economic outlook is gradually diminishing. With stronger policy support and an improved market environment, the business conditions of SMEs are expected to improve further. However, in order to realize a genuine economic recovery, New Zealand must push ahead with deep-rooted structural reforms to address the fundamental problems that have accumulated over a long period of time, with productivity enhancement being the core direction of the reforms. To this end, the government needs to increase investment in technology, education, and innovation to help enterprises improve productivity, so as to realize the transformation from high input, low output to high efficiency, high growth. The government should introduce relevant policies to encourage enterprises to carry out technological research and development and equipment upgrading, and support the development of high value-added industries. At the same time, it should strengthen the education and vocational training system and improve the skill level of the labor force to meet the needs of industrial upgrading. Addressing the challenges of an aging population and net loss of citizens is also an important part of the reform. The government can formulate a more flexible immigration policy to attract the return and settlement of skilled personnel from overseas, thereby supplementing the supply of the labor market. Meanwhile, measures should be taken to encourage the elderly to continue to participate in the labor market and prolong their working life, so as to alleviate the pressure of labor shortages. In addition, the pension security system should be improved, and the allocation of resources for medical care and pensions optimized, so as to alleviate the financial burden. Broadening and diversifying the export base is a key initiative to enhance economic resilience. 2025. New Zealand has already achieved remarkable results in export diversification. In the future, there is a need to further reduce reliance on a few agricultural products such as dairy and meat, and vigorously develop emerging export industries such as manufacturing, renewable energy, and technical services, so as to enhance the value-added and competitiveness of export products. At the same time, the government should continue to expand trade markets, consolidate trade relations with China, Australia, and the European Union, and strengthen cooperation with other countries and regions to actively participate in the regional economic integration process. Reduce trade barriers by signing free trade agreements and other means, so as to expand the space for export markets. Business confidence is another key element of economic recovery. The government needs to formulate clear and stable policies, maintain the consistency and predictability of the regulatory environment, and demonstrate a long-term stable development vision so that enterprises can be convinced that the current environment is suitable for reinvestment. It should also increase support for small and medium-sized enterprises (SMEs), optimize the financing environment, reduce the cost of financing, and resolve their operational difficulties in order to stimulate market vitality. In addition, fiscal policy needs to maintain a prudent balance. The government needs to find a balance between supporting economic recovery, controlling inflation and debt, and avoiding excessively tight fiscal policy that exacerbates economic recession or excessive spending that fuels inflation and debt risk. The government should optimize the fiscal expenditure structure, cut non-essential spending, and invest limited fiscal resources in areas that can promote economic growth in the long term, such as infrastructure development, education, and healthcare. Meanwhile, it should expand the tax base, increase fiscal revenue, and ease the pressure on fiscal balance through reasonable tax policies. The New Zealand Ministry of Finance has mentioned in its 2025 Economic Update report that it will implement fiscal discipline reforms in the future and strengthen support for core industries. If these initiatives can be effectively implemented, they will provide an important policy guarantee for economic recovery. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) forecasts that New Zealand's economy will achieve mildly positive growth in 2026 and accelerate in the second half of the year, with an annual growth rate of 1.5% to 2.0%. In 2027, the growth rate will further rise to 3%. New Zealand's economic woes in the first half of the year are not an isolated case, but rather a concentration of risks common to the world's small open economies and a wake-up call for similar economies. While the recovery process in the second half of the year provides a transformational lesson for similar economies, small open economies are generally characterized by small economies, homogeneous industrial structures, and high dependence on global trade and external financing. This development model was able to achieve rapid growth in an environment of economic globalization, low interest rates, and trade liberalization. However, the vulnerability of this development model will become more apparent against the backdrop of slowing economic globalization, rising interest rates, and rising trade protectionism. New Zealand's previous model of relying on cheap capital, a single export structure, and real estate to drive economic growth was highly similar to that of many small open economies. The outbreak of the economic crisis in New Zealand in the first half of the year was a concentrated manifestation of the shortcomings of this growth model. In its Economic Outlook 2025 report, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OEC) noted that increased barriers to global trade, tighter financial conditions, weakening business and consumer confidence, and rising policy uncertainty all pose significant risks to global economic growth. These risks hit small open economies in particular. Changes in the global economic environment are the common external factors that have led to the difficulties of the small open economies. In response to inflation, major central banks around the world have taken steps to raise interest rates, which has led to a rise in the global cost of financing, resulting in a significant increase in the cost of borrowing for the small open economies, which has led to a significant increase in the debt pressures faced by households, firms, and governments. At the same time, the slowdown in global economic growth has also led to a generalized lack of demand in international markets, while rising trade protectionism has further exacerbated trade barriers, which has seriously affected export growth in small open economies. New Zealand's experience suggests that economies that are overly dependent on a small number of trading partners and export commodities will face greater shocks when the global trading environment deteriorates, and that some of these risks can be effectively hedged through trade diversification and cooperation in free trade agreements. The significant increase in New Zealand's exports to Europe in 2025 is a case in point. However, internal structural problems are at the root of the long-term difficulties faced by small open economies. In addition to New Zealand's stagnant productivity, aging population, and net loss of citizens, many small open economies share common problems such as unitary industrial structures, insufficient innovation capacity, and weak infrastructure. These problems put small open economies at a disadvantage in global economic competition and make it difficult for them to adjust to external shocks. For example, many small open economies are overly reliant on tourism, agriculture, or resource exports, resulting in low value-added industries and weak resilience to risks. At the same time, insufficient investment in innovation has slowed industrial upgrading in these economies, making it difficult to cultivate new points of economic growth. In addition, weak infrastructure further constrains the improvement of productivity and sustainable economic development. New Zealand's experience shows that small open economies can effectively recover from external shocks if they can promote structural reforms, optimize their industrial structure, expand their diversified markets, and implement prudent macroeconomic policies at the same time. New Zealand's economic transformation also signals potential risks and development opportunities for similar economies. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) forecasts that global gross domestic product (GDP) growth will remain low at 2.9% in 2025 and 2026. Increased trade barriers may further dampen global trade growth, meaning that export growth in small open economies will remain under sustained pressure. At the same time, volatility in global financial markets may lead to the risk of capital outflows from these economies, and the pressure for local currency depreciation will increase further, pushing up the cost of imports and the level of inflation. For small open economies that also rely on cheap capital, a single export structure, and real estate growth, New Zealand's experience is of great significance. These economies should learn from New Zealand's lessons, review their economic structure and development model in advance, and identify and address potential risks in a timely manner. At the same time, they should actively learn from New Zealand's experience of transformation, expanding diversified markets through free trade agreements, and boosting business and consumer confidence through policy adjustments, adjusting policies to boost business and consumer confidence. To cope with these common risks, small open economies need to adopt a series of targeted measures. First, strengthen economic restructuring, promote industrial diversification, and cultivate multiple points of economic growth, so as to reduce dependence on a single industry and market. Second, strengthen international cooperation, actively participate in the reform of the global trading system, and promote trade liberalization and facilitation to reduce the impact of trade barriers. At the same time, strengthen financial cooperation with other countries and regions in order to enhance the ability to cope with financial market volatility. In addition, it should increase investment in innovation and education to enhance productivity and core competitiveness so as to achieve high-quality economic growth. At the same time, it should implement prudent macroeconomic policies, reasonably control the debt level, and maintain the flexibility of its fiscal and monetary policies, so as to enhance its ability to cope with external shocks. The recovery of the New Zealand economy from the crisis in the first half of the year to the recovery in the second half of the year shows that small open economies can effectively enhance their economic resilience as long as they adjust their policies and push forward reforms in a timely manner so as to achieve sustainable economic growth. Having said that, I believe we have a clear understanding of the ups and downs and turns of the New Zealand economy. Understanding New Zealand's experience is not only for watching the fun, but also for seeing the general trend of the global economy, especially for those who are concerned about the development of small and open economies, engaged in import and export trade, or have plans to invest overseas. New Zealand's experience and lessons learned are of high reference value. If you find today's content helpful, please feel free to like and comment below, and discuss with me your views on global economic trends. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on the little bell so that you don't miss out on more in-depth analysis of the global economy and industry dynamics. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.